This video covers Section 8.7, Absolute Value Equations and Inequalities, Objective 1, Solve Absolute Value Equations. Recall, the absolute value of a number is its distance from the origin on the real number line. So when we're looking at the absolute value of -8, we're asking how far it is from 0. And that distance is 8. Whereas the distance from 8 to 0 is 8. So the absolute value of -8 is 8, and the absolute value of 8 is also 8. So in solving absolute value equations, we need to keep in mind, for example 1, that we're asking what numbers have a distance to 0 of 8. Those two numbers that have a distance to 0 of 8 are 8 or -8. So 8 and -8 are the solutions to that equation. So either 8 or -8 has a distance to the origin of 8. This leads me to your practice problem. Practice 1, I encourage you to press pause in your video and work this out and press play again when you're ready to see the solution. Now that you've had your chance to work this out, I'll work this out with you. Practice 1, we're asking what numbers have a distance to 0 of 5. On the one side it's 5, and on the other side it's -5. So the two numbers that work here, x equals 5 or x equals -5. So the solutions to this equation are 5 and -5. So this type of an example shows us that when you have the absolute value equaling a positive real number, it says that we do two things. We drop the absolute value bars and keep the right-hand side the same. We drop the absolute value bars and take the opposite of the right-hand side. So it says if the absolute value of u is a, drop them, keep everything the same, drop them and take the opposite to the right-hand side. This requires you to always make sure step 1 is done first. Isolate the expression containing the absolute value. Then you apply the process. Drop them and keep it the same. Drop them and take opposite. So once you've done step 1 and notice they're isolated, you drop the absolute value bars, keep it the same. Drop the absolute value bars and take the opposite. And now we have the two equations to solve. Adding 5 to both sides gives me 14. Dividing by 2 gives me 7. Adding 5 to both sides gives me -4. Dividing by 2 gives me -2. So we have x is 7 or x is -2. So the solutions are -2 and 7. But be very careful. In letter B, the absolute value has not been isolated yet. So we must isolate the absolute value of 2x minus 5. And we achieve that by getting rid of the portion that's being added or subtracted first. So we subtract 4 from both sides and get 5, or 5 times the absolute value of 2x minus 5 equals 5. We solve for the absolute value by dividing both sides by 5, and we have the absolute value of 2x minus 5 is equal to 1. Now that we've got it isolated, we apply our process of dropping the absolute value, keeping it the same, dropping the absolute value, and taking the opposite. Two separate inequalities to solve. Both of them we're going to add 5 to both sides. And divide by 2. Add 5 to both sides. And divide by 2. So 2 or negative 3 are the solutions. And this leads me to 3 practice problems for you to try. I encourage you to press pause in your video and work these out and come back when you're ready to see the solution. Notice first how each one of those you need to isolate the absolute value first. Now that you've had a chance to work these out, I'll work these out with you. Letter A, absolute value of x minus 5 plus 4 equals 9. We need to isolate this absolute value of x minus 5. So we subtract 4 from both sides. Now we apply the process. Drop the absolute value bars, keep it the same. Drop the absolute value bars and take the opposite. Now we have 2 separate linear equations to solve by adding 5 to both sides, and we get x is equal to 10 or x is equal to 0. 10 or 0. This one's easy to see visually because the 2 numbers are 0 and 10, and halfway between those is 5. We just asked what numbers have a distance to 5 equal to 5. 5 to the right is 10. 5 to the left is 0. Letter B, we isolate the absolute values by subtracting 4 from both sides, and we get 9. 3 times the absolute value of x plus 2 is equal to 9. Dividing both sides by 3, we get the absolute value of x plus 2 is equal to 3. So we apply the process, drop the absolute value bars, keep it the same, or drop the absolute value bars and take the opposite. Both of these are solved by subtracting 2 from both sides, and we get x equals 1, or we get x is negative 5. When looking at this statement here, judging by the solutions, we have negative 5 and 1. Halfway between those numbers is negative 2. We went 3 to the right and 3 to the left. That's the distance portion of it. The opposite of that number is what we call the center. Letter C, the absolute value of x plus 2 plus 4 is equal to 1. If we subtract 4 from both sides, we get 1 minus 4 is negative 3. In remembering that that number right there is the distance, letter C says, when can the distance to negative 2 be negative 3? And distances are never negative. So going back to the process, equations involving absolute value, if this A is less than 0, the equation has no solution. This we cannot solve because distances cannot be negative. So you have to be careful here and just write no solution when you see that kind of thing. Don't apply the process because it won't work. When you have equations involving two absolute values, if you drop them, keep everything the same, drop them and take the opposite, you will find out that all you need to do is simply just do the same thing. Drop them, keep everything the same, drop them, and take the opposite. But you have to remember to use that minus sign and put it in parentheses. This one I'll solve by subtracting x from both sides and subtracting 3. This one we'll have to distribute the negative across. For this one, I'll add 2x to both sides and add 5 to both sides. Dividing both sides by 3, we get x is equal to 2/3. So x equals negative 8, or x is equal to 2/3. And this leads me to your practice problem. I encourage you to press pause on your video and work this out. Come back when you're ready to see the solution. Now that you've had a chance to work this out, I'll work this out with you. So we drop the absolute value bars and keep everything the same. Drop them and take the opposite. And there's two linear equations for us to solve. We solve this by subtracting x from both sides and subtracting 3 from both sides. 1 minus 3 is negative 2. Distributing the negative across, we solve this one by adding 2x to both sides and subtracting 1 from both sides. Dividing both sides by 3, we get x is equal to negative 4/3. So x equals negative 2, or x is equal to negative 4/3. And this concludes the video for section 8.7, absolute value, equations, and inequalities. Objective 1, solve absolute value equations.